Hey class, hope you guys are doing well. Hope you're having a good time at home. And just want to start off by saying if you're struggling obtaining the knowledge and understanding from these lessons, please reach out to me, email me, text me, call me, just let me know. So we're starting chapter 13, the plant kingdom, right? So we're talking about botany. Chapter 13 is botany part 1, chapter 14 is botany part 2. Some of this stuff you might have learned in terms of the diagrams and labeling. You might have learned some of this in elementary school, as biology is something that you study, basically every 3 years throughout your education process. But we're going to be getting into a little more depth and detail. So the stuff that is reviewed, that's fine. It's supposed to be plants are something that we do study a lot in elementary school. So moving into botany, botany is the study of plants. All right. So I just want you to look at these learning objectives for chapter 13. First of all is to know the general characteristics of plants, including the different types of plant tissues and their functions. Secondly, to describe the basic classification of plants. Thirdly, to label the different parts of a leaf. And lastly, to differentiate between monocots and dicots by their leaf venation, root system types, and flower multiples. When I say leaf venation, venation is the veins or the way that materials are transported throughout the plant. Okay, so those are our learning objectives, so let's jump in. First of all, the general characteristics of plants, right? You've got their structure in terms of on a cellular level, their nutrition, right? Plants can be autotrophic and heterotrophic. Autotrophic meaning they produce their own food from photosynthesis, but also some plants are heterotrophic, meaning they obtain their nutrients from other animals or other plants, right? Reproduction, whether they reproduce asexually or sexually, and motility, that's like whether they're able to move or where they're planted, okay? So first of all, cellular structure. Plants are eukaryotic, okay, meaning that they have a membrane-bound nucleus and organelles, all right? Different from prokaryotic. Prokaryotic is organisms that have no membrane-bound nucleus, no membrane-bound organelles, okay, so their DNA material is just floating throughout the cell. They have tissues, which we will talk about, the different tissues. Some plants have organs, all right? Most plants have chlorophyll and other pigments, right? For example, chlorophyll is the primary catalyst in photosynthesis. Chlorophyll helps to obtain and absorb sunlight, right? So most plants have chlorophyll, which is one of the things that gives it the ability to be autotrophic, okay? Also, plants have cellulose in their cell walls, all right? When we went over photosynthesis, one of the products of photosynthesis we said was sugar, all right? Cellulose is a form of sugar that comes from that G3P that's produced in photosynthesis, all right? So nutrition, most plants are autotrophic, meaning they produce their own food, but some are heterotrophic or parasitic. What is parasitic? Parasitic means that it lives off of another organism, right? So plants that are living on other plants, right? Some plants might be living on, sea animals, okay? Reproduction, all reproduce sexually, but some also have asexual forms of reproduction, okay? So that is a reproductive characteristic of plants. Motility, most plants are sessile. What does that mean? That they don't move, right? That they are planted in the ground. But some plants float. Other plants produce motile or movable gametes, okay? Gametes are like the sperm for the male plant. Usually we would call this pollen, okay? And so moving into our first classification of plants, right? So we'll get into the breakdown of plants because you need to be able to describe and explain the classification. But one of the main classifications is non-vascular plants, meaning vascular tissue. These are plants that have veins that transport water. So we're talking about non-vascular. So they have no veins that transport water, all right? Things like moss, all right, and the worts, okay? These are non-vascular plants, and you'll see some pictures of them But the first, the phylum, right? From chapter 9, we learned about the classification of um, living things: kingdom, phylum, class, order, family, genus, species, right? Those are the 7. Okay, so we're talking about under kingdom. The kingdom is the plant kingdom, or plantae in your book. And the phylum, right, is our second breakdown of classification. The phylum is bryophyte, right? These are the mosses. So the anatomy of a moss is that it has a leafy shoot and a rhizoid, right? Leafy shoot is like a root. The rhizoid is like a root, okay? But it doesn't have the ability to transport water to the rest of the plant, okay? Same thing with the leafy shoot, right? It's a leaf-like structure, but it also does not have water-conducting tissue, okay? And so this is the difference between vascular and non-vascular. Mosses are non-vascular plants because they do not have water-conducting tissue. So you need to know the difference between non-vascular and vascular. You also need to know how leafy shoot and rhizoid are different from roots and leaves. Okay, so here's a picture of moss, right? So the moss just can only live in wet areas because it has no way to transport the water throughout the plant. Okay, so it has to have water right there on its leaves and in its roots. Okay. More about mosses, right? Mosses have a life cycle, right? That leafy shoot produces gametes. Okay, this is what we would call the gametophyte generation. Okay, because gametes are haploid. You have an antheridia, which is the sac produced by the top of the male gametophyte, and the archegonia, a vase-shaped growth on the top of the female gametophyte. Okay, together, if the sperm unites with the egg, right? If the antheridia's sac is in contact with the archegonia's vase shape, right? It will go down and it will fertilize the ovum. Okay, we call a fertilized ovum a zygote. Just like in humans, as we talked about, sperm and egg, when they unite, they create a diploid zygote. All right, so this produces spores in the capsule, and then you enter the sporophyte generation, right? The capsule that holds the spores, and eventually those spores will fall into the ground and new plants will grow. Okay, so that is we call this the alternation of generations, meaning it goes from a gametophyte generation where it lives as male and female different parts, right? But then when they are fertilized, they create spores, okay, which are then diploid, and we call this the sporophyte generation. Okay, so this is an important process that you'll need to learn, and you'll see it in other, like the ferns. See the same thing in the ferns, the alternation of generations. Here you see the haploid gametophyte gives rise to the diploid sporophyte generation, and the spores give rise to the next gametophyte. So these generations go back and forth. The sporophytes, when they're united, they create the gametophytes, when they're united, they're haploid. When they're united, they create a zygote. Okay, and that zygote is a sporophyte. That sporophyte will drop spores into the ground. Okay, and when that spore grows, it will be a gametophyte plant, meaning that it will have either male or female parts. Okay, so that's how this alternation goes back and forth. It goes from gametophyte to sporophyte and then back to gametophyte, and this continues to go back and forth. The dominant generation. What is dominant generation? This is the generation that the plant exists in for most of its life. So because the gametophyte generation is more often seen, it is therefore considered to be the dominant generation. Okay, so that's what we talk about when we're talking about dominant generation. Here's another picture of moss, as you can see on a wall, and I'm sure you guys have seen moss. I can show you some moss in my backyard growing on the fence that we have, and if moss doesn't necessarily always have a bad smell, but you also have, relatives of moss like mold that grow in wet places. Okay, and mold does smell. All right, so the worts, phylum Heptophyta and Anthoceraphita. Okay, you're not going to need to know the phylum names for all these, okay, but we're going to go quickly through the worts because you don't need to know so much. But in your book, you can see in the anatomy of the Heptophyta, the thallus, right? The gametophyte is a flattened, leathery structure, and it's very similar to that of the mosses, where you have the alternation of generations. Okay, the sporophyte that grows out of the gametophyte looks like a thin green horn, single large chloroplast, and different from other plants that have multiple chloroplasts. Here's a little picture of the worts. Okay, another picture of warts, right? And when we talk about warts, we're not talking about the warts that you get on your skin. They are not related. Okay, so let's get into the breakdown. We just talked about non-vascular plants, and now we're going to jump into vascular plants. So if we were to break down the plant kingdom, we would first say the first breakdown is of the plant kingdom. You have the plant kingdom, and then underneath it you would have non-vascular and vascular, right? And under non-vascular, we talked about two of the phylum, right? The mosses and the warts. But then we're going to break down into under the vascular plant classification. And under the vascular plants, you then break it down again into two different categories. One type of vascular plants is without seeds, and one is with seeds. And then if we broke down even further, those with seeds are either non-flowering or flowering. And then one step even further, of the flowering plants, we have two types of flowering plants, monocots and dicots. And so let's get into it. First of all, as we look on here, our first breakdown without seeds. All right, so the phylum Pteridophyta, the ferns, right? The life cycle of a fern. Okay, hopefully you guys all know what a fern looks like. Let's see, there's a picture of a fiddlehead from the fern, right? Ferns have the little black dots underneath. Okay, and so we're talking about the fern. The sori, these are the collections of spore, as you can see right there, underneath the leaf. All right, they produce sporangia. Okay, the prothallus is the heart-shaped of germinated spores, not fertilized, but germinated. Okay, these are spores that are beginning to grow out of the ground. Okay, and then it produces its first leaf, which is like the fan-shaped blade, as you can see, the big blade of, these are like little fans. Second leaf is the fiddlehead. So once it creates the fan-shaped blade, then as it grows out, it will create the fiddlehead, and there's the picture of the fiddlehead. Why do you call it a fiddlehead? Because if you've ever heard of a fiddle, it's a musical instrument. That is the end of, that's what it looks like, kind of like a violin, the end of a violin. Okay, fiddle is very similar to that. Other phylums that have no seeds, Chenophyta, horsetails, they grow in wet environments, Lycophyta, the club mosses, and Xylophyta, the wisp ferns, right? So you don't have to know all these, but it's important to understand the life cycle of the ferns, because ferns are very, very prominent, especially in our area, but throughout the world, okay? So there's another picture of ferns, and you can see that kind of fan-shaped blade. All right, so moving on to plants with seeds, okay? But more specifically, first of all, we're going to talk about plants with seeds, but that are not flowering, okay? And so we call these gymnosperms, non-flowering plants. The most common of these is the Coniferaophyta, okay? It's a very easy way to remember if you think of conifer. A conifer is a plant that produces cones, all right? So if you go snowboarding or skiing, as we did in Utah, you could see in the trees, those are all pine trees, right? And you think of pine trees, they produce pine cones. These are all gymnosperms, okay? So your Christmas tree is a gymnosperm, but more specifically, it's a phylum of the Coniferaophyta, the cone-bearing plants. But there's other phyla inside of gymnosperms, Cycadophyta, Ginkgophyta, Gnetophyta, okay? So you don't need to know all those. You do need to know gymnosperms are non-flowering plants, and you do need to know that the conifers are cone-bearing plants. So conifer, cone-bearing, okay? Say that 5 times to help you remember it. All right, so there's a picture of a cone. You can see from the conifers, Coniferaophyta, some more pine trees, right? These are all conifers. These are all cone-bearing plants. So we talked about gymnosperms. Those are non-flowering plants. So we're talking about, if you go here, you can see these are plants with seeds, right? Gymnosperms are plants with seeds, okay? But these are non-flowering plants, right? Angiosperms are plants with seeds, okay? We're in the category of vascular plants with seeds, and now even more that have flowers, right? Flowering plants, okay? The Anthophyta is the phylum of, sorry about that. Anthophyta is the flowering plants, okay? So here's a picture of a flower, right? And if you look on the screen, you can see you've got the, when we get into chapter 14, we're going to get into the anatomy, what is what. But as you learned in elementary school, right, you've got the anther, you've got the filament, okay? you've got the stigma, the style, okay, and then down inside here is the ovary, right? You've got the leaf, the petal, okay, and these together, this whole circle, we call that the corona, right, or the corolla, meaning crown, okay, and of course we are in the midst of the coronavirus, so that's what corona means, is crown. All right, another picture of a flower. Here you've got the anther, the filament, okay, and here this is what we call the stigma. This big long thing is the style, and at the bottom you have the ovary and the ovule. All right, so in order for the male gametes to get to the female part of the plant, you need a bug or wind or something like that, you know, a bee to touch this, and then to touch this, and then that will fertilize the plant. That's how all fruit are made. Fruit are just simply when a certain bug puts or something, somehow this male gamete gets to the female part of the plant, and it fertilizes the ovum. That ovum, when it matures, it becomes a fruit. That is all a fruit is a mature ovary with the seeds inside. All right. So moving on to the flowering plants, the breakdowns. The first type is a monocot, and mono meaning one cot, a monocotyledon, right? So one cotyledon. What is a cotyledon? Well, if you could think of like corn is like a single unit, right? But then if you were to take a peanut, right? And if you were to look at a whole peanut and you were to separate it, you'd see that the peanut has two halves. So a monocot, like corn, is different from a peanut, which is a dicot, which we get to. But one way that you can tell whether a plant is a monocot is, first of all, does it flower? Okay. If it flowers, of course it's vascular. And if it flowers, it's either monocot or dicot. So if you look at the venation, right, like if you look at grass, you can see on a piece of grass, there's let's see if I can show you, like on a piece of grass, you can see that there's straight lines, okay? Let me see if I have a good picture. Okay, well, we're just going to have to go with this. You can see that there's straight lines on the leaf, right, like grass, right? That's parallel because the veins are parallel. And you could go get a piece of grass out in your yard and you could look at it, but you see parallel venation. It usually has a fibrous root system, okay? So important to understand what that means. What does fibrous mean? Well, fibrous means that it spreads out, throughout. See how this, like grass, when you pick up grass, it pulls. And so like you could pick up a large chunk of grass and it will just continue to pull up more and more grass because all the roots are what are called fibrous root system, okay? And here's like corn. You have a single cotyledon. You have a fibrous root system. The venation is parallel, and it comes in multiples of 3 or 6, we say, but 6 is a multiple of 3. So we say it comes in multiples of 3, okay? Now, the vascular tissue is not something that I said you need to know, but it does come scattered bundles, right? Scattered all throughout the plant, whereas in a dicot, it is ringed, meaning as the plant gets bigger and bigger and bigger, these vascular tissues start to get wider and wider and wider, and the inside is no longer vascular, okay? Also, in the young, they have scattered vascular bundles. In the mature, they have hollow stems. So if you were to think about like bamboo, when you cut open a bamboo stick, it's hollow, right? When a bamboo is young, it's got scattered vascular bundles, right? But bamboo is monocot, right? And moving to dicot, 2 cotyledons, di meaning 2, dicotyledon. They have a netted venation. Okay, what does netted venation mean? Well, if you look at the veins, it's kind of like a net, all right, in the leaves. Okay, they're not parallel. That's what we call netted. Okay, and the root system is called the taproot, where the root just goes straight down. So like when you look at a tree, generally the height of the tree, the root will go just about as deep as the height of the tree. Not always, but a lot of the times. Okay. Now, in a case like a palm tree, right? A palm tree won't have a root that goes as deep as other type of tree. But how does the palm tree adapt for that? Is it bends. Okay. So mature stems are solid. Young stems are vascular bundles. The flowers usually come in 4s or 5s or multiples of these numbers. Right, the cotyledon contains stored food to nourish the embryonic plant while it's in the seed to supply the huge spout with energy until it can carry on photosynthesis. So basically, this cotyledon is basically just a bunch of food. So when there's a tiny little part in here, which hopefully we'll see in a second on another slide, that's going to be the first leaf, right? And as it starts to grow, that leaf is going to feed off of all of this material so that it can grow and get above ground, okay? Plants do not need sunlight to get from a seed above the ground. They do not need sunlight. But once they're above the ground, they need sunlight to survive, to carry on photosynthesis. Okay, once the cotyledon is out of energy. And so you can see here's the seed, right? And you can see the little plant inside, right? The embryonic root, the first leaves of the tree, right? And you can see here the first true leaves inside the plant. And you have the two cotyledons, right, inside there, and you got the seed coat, and you got the endosperm, which the plant's going to eat until it grows, okay, large enough. All right, plant tissues, moving forward, all right, from our classification, we're going into our plant tissues. There's different tissues, dermal, right, kind of like skin. Vascular tissue is the tissue that transports nutrients throughout the plant. Ground tissue, meristematic tissue, right, these are different. There's also different plant cell types, okay? We're not going to get too much into the plant cell types, but we are going to talk about the different tissues, right? So the dermal tissue is the outer covering of the plant, okay? We have the epidermis, which is the outer layer of cells on like a leaf, and then the cuticle is the waxy layer, part of the dermal tissue that covers the leaves, right? If you feel the top of a leaf, sometimes it feels a little bit slick. It allows water to move easily over the top of it. That is the cuticle, okay? Talking about vascular tissue, we have two main types of vascular tissues. Of course, you have to know them, probably learn them in elementary school. The xylem and the phloem. Xylem carries water and dissolved minerals primarily from the roots upwards, okay, made of two types of cells, tracheids, which are narrow, and the vessel cell, which is stacked. Most important to understand is that the xylem transports water primarily and dissolved minerals up from the roots. The phloem carries water and dissolved foods, usually sugar, from the leaves throughout the plants. So after photosynthesis happens in the leaf, right, then the phloem will take that sugar that was created through photosynthesis and carry it back through the plant. So you might want to take a moment here and see if you can remember the classification of plants, right, just to test yourself, see how well you've been able to check for comprehension. For example, the classification begins with, we have the plant kingdom. The plant kingdom is broken down into two categories, okay? You've got vascular and non-vascular, okay? You guys should be able to do this on your own, so if you want to pause the video, you can. Breaking down from vascular tissues, we have vascular tissues that have seeds and vascular tissues that do not have seeds. Then we have, from the vascular tissues that have seeds, we have flowering plants and non-flowering plants, okay? From the flowering plants, then we have a breakdown even further of monocots and dicots, okay? So we are talking about now vascular tissues, all right? We're talking about vascular plants. Our second category that we're talking about is tissues, okay? We've got the xylem, the phloem, right? We talked about dermal tissue, now vascular tissue, the xylem and the phloem, understanding the purposes of each of those, all right? So you've got different pictures of the xylem, right? Here's the xylem, this reddish area. The phloem is this area, larger, okay? So water passes through this red area, and the phloem passes water, the phloem passes nutrients, and it can even pass water to the rest of the plant, okay? Ground tissue is what makes up the remainder of the inside of the plant, and then meristematic tissue, composed of plant cells that are capable of continuous mitosis. So meristematic tissue is like the growth tissue, all right? We always talk about growth in two ways, primary and secondary. Primary growth is like a plant growing up in height or a branch growing out in length. And secondary growth is its growth in width, okay? So a plant will grow tall, and then the stem will start to widen until you have, which is secondary growth. And all this is done with meristematic tissue, all right? Plant cell types. Parenchyma stores food and manufactures food. Collenchyma strengthens in the stems and the leaves, and the sclerenchyma strengthens in vascular tissues, okay? Pretty much all you would need to know is if I gave you those three, you'd be able to do like a matching for those three. You don't have to have them all memorized, but it's important that you're aware of the different cell types that are in plants, okay? So breakdown of the leaf, moving into our diagrams. Okay, so we're going to get into some of the breakdowns of leaf. First part is the blade. The main part of the leaf that you see is the blade. The dicot's large flattened area, right? The petiole is what connects the blade to the stem. Stipules are structures attached to the base of the petiole that can exhibit many different shapes. Okay, so these are some of the breakdowns of the leaf. You'll see a diagram of it as we move forward. Leaf venation, meaning the veins, they can either be parallel or netted, right? And netted venation have many very different, well, parallels do too, but mainly the netted ones have much more different shapes that they can take. And these are just two very simple shapes that I have right here, and you'll see a bunch of them as we move forward. Pinnate, the veins branch from one central vein, whereas palmate, veins branch from two or more central veins. So if you think of like a maple leaf as a palmate branch, it kind of looks like the vein, like the lines on your palm. In pinnate are, your simple leaf branch, right? The leaflet is the blade division, right? So you've got here, you've got netted venation, and here you've got parallel venation. But even as we go deeper into netted venation to understand different types, there's just a zoomed in picture of the netted venation. You can see how it looks like a net, okay? Here's the layer of the leaf, okay? And so you've got down here, you've got the lower epidermis and the upper epidermis. Okay, at the top of the leaf, you've got the cuticle, okay? In here, you've got your vascular tissues, right? The xylem is blue because it's carrying water, and the phloem right here is white, it's carrying nutrients and materials. This top part is all, straight palisade, meaning upper. We call this the palisade mesophyll, okay? This calls this is calling this right here a palisade cell. This area is called the palisade mesophyll. This area, because it's all kind of it's got little holes and stuff like that, it's called the spongy mesophyll. You can see that here, okay? And around here you've got these little donuts, okay? This is called a guard cell, right? And that little hole can open or close, and that is called the stoma. Okay, very important. That lets gases and things out of the leaf, right? When oxygen happens in photosynthesis, when oxygen is released, it comes out of the stoma. All right, very important to understand that. In the guard cells are simply just, kind of like regulating what comes in and what goes out of that leaf. Here's a more, detailed picture. You can see the pores closed, the pores are open, closing, not letting anything out, opening, letting things in and out, okay? So taking the section of the leaf right here, you can see that this is a pinnate, not palmate, because it's just a central vein branching off. All right, and you've got the xylem tissue here, the phloem tissue, the palisade mesophyll, the spongy mesophyll. Okay, the chloroplasts are in both of these. Okay, and this right here we call the vein, right? This is the vascular tissue. All right, you've got the epidermis, the upper epidermis. Okay, right? You see the stoma, these holes. Okay. Very important to understand the leaf. Stomata is the little opening on the underside of some leaves, right? Also known as the stoma. Guard cells that are around the stoma, okay? The epidermis, you have the upper epidermis as I showed you, the lower epidermis, right? This is this area, the dermal tissue, okay? Palisade mesophyll is the upper layer of the leaf right here, palisade mesophyll. And then you have the spongy mesophyll, the lower part, irregularly shaped cells with airspace between them. On image 13b9 in your book, you can see the structure of a typical leaf. All right, so leaves are either deciduous, meaning they lose their leaves before winter. Okay, they form an abscission layer, which is where the leaf will be dying. Okay, and it'll separate the leaf from the plant. Or you have persistent foliage, which we have a lot of this in LA because we don't have seasons. When leaves don't fall off until spring, right? New leaves are formed. So the new leaf coming out pushes the old leaf out, all right? Carotenoids, these are responsible for the yellow-orange colors in plants, in the leaves of plants. Anthocyanins are responsible for the blue and violet colors in the plants, all right? I want to just take a moment to show you, like in our book, The Plant Kingdom, right? Botany Part 1, Chapter 13. I'll post this PDF on the Google Classroom, but you can go through this and you can see here is the breakdown, right? You've got the four main characteristics general characteristics of the plant kingdom. Here you have the main groups of the plant phylum, right? The breakdown: non-vascular, vascular. You've got vascular without seeds, vascular with seeds. Vascular with seeds are non-flowering and flowering. And then of the flowering, you have the monocots and dicots. Okay. You also have the alternation of generation right here, the sporophyte generation on this side. Okay. And then you have the gametophyte generation on this side. Okay. So there's the alternation of generation happening right there. This is a typical moss showing the alternation of generations. Okay. Also, you have the ferns, right? The ferns, here's also the alternation of generation from the sporophyte generation to the gametophyte generation. And as we talked about the Prothallus, right, we have the Archegonia and the Antheridium. Okay, the ovum, that's the female, and this is the male. Right, together they create a young sporophyte, which leads us to the sporophyte generation. Okay, vascular plants with seeds. Okay, right here's the conifers, right, the cone-bearing plants. The flowering plants, right, monocots and dicots, right? So these are non-flowering with seeds, cone-bearing plants, and you have the flowering, plants with seeds that are flowering, okay? And there's that little image that I showed you. You should memorize this chart right here, okay? Plant anatomy, talking about tissues: dermal, vascular. Main are the xylem and phloem of vascular. You need to know that. Ground tissue and meristematic tissue. And you can see this chart just kind of breaks it down. You don't have to know this whole chart, of course, but it is important to understand, like, the dermal is the epidermis. If I asked you what type of tissue is the epidermis, you should say dermal. Xylem and phloem are examples of what type of plant tissue? Vascular, right? If I said the parenchyma or the spongy mesophyll are examples of what type of tissue? Ground tissue. And vascular cambium is an example of what? The meristematic tissue, okay? So you need to understand that. And here's some pictures of, these are all pinnate, right? This right here is talking about the edges, right? Serrate edges, dentate edges, undulate edges, and entire, okay? And then over here you have the actual shape of the leaf, right? Circular shape, cordate, which is heart-shaped, linear, okay? You have veins, which are like parallel, simple pinnate, so these are some veins and these are some shapes, all right? You also have complex ones like palmately compound. Compound meaning there's different leaves on a single leaf, right? So that's compound right there. Okay, this is simple because it's just a single leaf, but this is a compound leaf because it has leaves coming off of it. Again, compound because there's little leaves coming off of the leaf. But this would be simple palmate, and this would be palmately compound. Okay. Then you also have things like deltoid. The shape is a deltoid. Delta meaning triangular. Cordate like a heart. All right. Lobed, looks like little earlobes. All right. So it's important to go through the book. Here's that picture of the leaf, the inside of the leaf. So you need to memorize that chart. Okay. We're not going to do a whole ton about the roots, but I'm going to go back to the lecture and explain this, but you can look at these pictures. But as you see, the growth region of the root is the meristematic region, okay? And then the maturation region is the region that grows in width, okay? Just as I finish talking about different branching patterns, over here on the right, you have excurrent, deliquescent, and columnar. You should know these three. Excurrent is like a Christmas tree. Deliquescent is your traditional tree shape that you think about, and columnar looks like a column. So if you just remember excurrent and columnar, then deliquescent is a little bit harder to remember, okay? Columnar is easy, looks like a column. Excurrent is a little bit of a hard word, but you need to remember that's the Christmas tree look, okay? And then deliquescent is the regular branching pattern, okay? You do not need to know everything about all the different buds and the branches and stuff like this. It is interesting to learn about as you look at the plants and we enter spring and you see a lot of buds and you can find all of these things. Maybe I'll show you an image of my backyard because my mother-in-law has tons of plants. All right, but you can also see the different wood lines, all right, the different things when you buy, like a 2x4, you see these lines in the wood, all right, and that's what they are. They're just layers of hot and cold where the plant created bark and the vascular tissue moved outward or inward, okay? You have different types of monocots and dicots, but at the end of the chapter, you have different, special types of plants. These are all very interesting, and I end the lecture with this, like aquatic leaves, all right, Something very, very famous right now, are succulent plants, right? So you've got plants with succulent leaves, which just means that they can hold water, right? An aloe plant, right? You can cut it open and you can put it on your skin after a sunburn, all right? So let's jump back into the lecture. The roots, functions of the root you need to know are to anchor the plant, absorb water and dissolve minerals, transport nutrients, and store food, all right? Those are the 4 functions of the roots. And the 2 types of root systems, as we already went over for monocot and dicot, but a taproot, which goes straight down, and a fibrous root, which spreads out along the surface of the ground. All right, primary growth. We talked about primary and secondary growth. Primary growth, you have the root cap, which covers the tip of the root, the meristematic region, elongation region, and maturation region. All right. The primary tissues, you have root hairs, cortex, endodermis, vascular cylinder, and pericycle. So you can go through those, and I don't want to spend too much time on that. All right, but it is important to understand that primary growth is growth in length, whereas secondary growth is growth in width. Okay, so different types of branching patterns, as I just went over: excurrent, deliquescent, and columnar. Go to the the book and look at those right here on page 355. Woody stems, different types: apical, meristem, where differentiation to leaves, stem tissue, and flowers take place. The dormant buds, buds that live through the winter. Bud scales protect new leaves. Leaf scars, where a leaf was on a deciduous plant, and then the nodes where the leaves are produced. So you can see all of that here, right? You can see the node, right? You can see the bud scale. You can see the bundle scars, okay? You can see all that, the leaf scar where a leaf was from the previous year, all right? And you can see all that. And you can, I would suggest that you go outside and find a plant and look at it and try and see if you can label all these. We might do at the end of next week or midway through next week, we'll probably do a scavenger hunt where you'll be sending me pictures of these different types of things, okay? The internal structure and growth, right? You have this, okay? All of this stuff, okay? Also down here, the heartwood, sapwood, okay? You can also see, let's see if we can find so you can look, here's the pith, right? And then out here you have the cortex. And then in these little bundles you have the vascular tissue, okay? So that's what all this is. Wood is the secondary xylem tissue. Spring wood is the larger and lighter, whereas the summer wood is more dense and darker because of the temperature. Annual rings are layers of spring wood and summer wood, but they could also be layers of hot and cold. So you don't always have 2 layers per year. You could have several layers per year depending on the temperature of that year. Okay? All right, moving forward, the roots, the growth of the bark. All of the tissues from the vascular cambium outward, you have the inner bark, the outer bark, and lenticels. All right? So you can see that here in the bark. You have inner bark and outer bark. We talked about spring wood and summer wood. Okay? Here's where we talk about the growth of bark. You can look over that. Moving into our last section right here, modified leaves. Okay, right, like a vine. You have this is like a leaf. It's called a tendril, where it wraps itself around something else to hold it, to anchor itself. Okay, and we'll talk about the way that plants attract themselves to other things in our next chapter. Okay, so you have herbaceous dicot and monocot stems. Right, tendril wraps itself for support. Spine, thorn, and prickles. Right? A spine is a leaf, a thorn is a branch, and a prickle is an outgrowth of epidermal tissue. So they have specific classifications in science, right? Succulent leaves store water, aquatic leaves float, and bracts are small flowers in the center of groups, okay? Now, you don't have to know all the rest of these are important to understand and to know, okay? But moving forward, we're just going to talk about these. You don't have to know the rest of these. You should know these modified plant parts on this page. Like storage roots, thick and fleshy roots store starches, adventitious roots, roots that grow from a stem, petiole, or a leaf, aerial roots anchor the plant and store water for dry periods, aquatic roots and parasitic roots, roots that are growing underwater, grow into vascular tissues, succulent stems contain large quantity of waters, stolons are horizontal extensions of the stem that act as a secondary root, rhizomes, underground stems that produce a leaf or leaf-bearing branches, bulbs are underground storage leaves. An example of a bulb would be like an onion, right? Maybe Tubers is a storage stem. Corms, thick underground stems that produce aerial leaves. All right, so that's the end of chapter 13. Just really quick, I want to show you, a picture. You can see here's the bulbs, right? You see a potato, right, is a tuber. A bulb, right, is an onion. Okay, so you can see the different things, right? Like a carrot would be like a root. Okay, very specific things that all of these are, right? There's your potato. All right, so if you leave the potato in water, of course, it'll start to grow again, these little roots, right? Because it's a tuber. All right, so it's important to understand those. And if you have any questions, please let me know. Hope you guys are doing well, and I'll hopefully see you guys soon.